This is, for those joining us, the Scholars at Risk 2020 Global Congress in virtual format. And we'll be beginning our next session, our plenary session now. The title for this session is A Conversation with Laurel Leff, author of Well Worth Saving, American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. I'm Rob Quinn, Executive Director of Scholars at Risk, and I'll be leading the conversation. If I can, let me just put this up. This is the book we'll be discussing, Well Worth Saving. With me is Laurel Leff, but first a few housekeeping items. During each of the Congress sessions, a reminder that we have a Q&A feature built into Zoom at the bottom of your screen. So for all participants who would like to ask questions as we go along, please use the Q&A function. Your video and audio are turned off. We have too many participants to allow that many cameras. And if you wish, you can submit your questions anonymously if you don't want your name appearing in the queue. We also encourage you to contribute to the social media conversation using Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, using or tagging @ScholarsAtRisk or the hashtag SAR Congress 2020. And for those who have missed either the two morning sessions or unable to join us for the rest of the program, we'll be recording the entire Congress, making it available on our website in the coming weeks. And then finally, a reminder that all of us wish we were meeting together in person. So please mark your calendars, November 16th to 20th, 2020 in New York City. We're working on plans to hopefully be able to reschedule some of the in-person elements of the Congress. So with those details aside, I'm very pleased to welcome as our plenary discussant, Professor Laurel Leff. She's an associate professor of journalism at Northeastern University, where she's also associate director of the Jewish Studies program. Leff was formerly a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald, and an editor at American Lawyer Media and the Hartford Courant. She teaches undergraduate courses and graduate courses in news writing, media law, nonfiction writing, and on America and the Holocaust. She's published several books, scholarly articles, book chapters, and book reviews on media and the Holocaust, and with us today to discuss, as I said, her most recent book, Well Worth Saving, American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. It tells the other side of the response to the U.S. Academy to urgent pleas by scholars and researchers across Europe for invitations and positions that would literally not only have saved their work, but saved their lives. Laura, welcome to the SAR 2020 Congress in virtual format.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's too bad we have to do this virtually, but I'm really excited to talk to you about this and to learn about the work that Scholars at Risk are doing at the same time.
Terrific. And so why don't we just start? What made you want to tell this side of the World War II era scholar story?
Well, I think it somewhat is the same motivation that brought me to write my first book, which was Buried by the Times, about the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust, which was there was a conventional wisdom, a general story out there. In the case of the Times, it was that nobody knew anything about the Holocaust while it was happening. And so my impulse was that's not true. So why is that story being told? And when it came to the scholars and doing work connected with the American response to the Holocaust, one of the strongest, dominant, what I would to some extent call a mythology, was that the American Academy was very welcoming of European scholars, that, it saved Hannah Arendt and Albert Einstein, and of course all of that is true, but it seemed to me, and in looking at some of the archives, particularly those of the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, that there were far more scholars who needed help, who applied for help, who sought help in coming to the United States and weren't able to. So it seemed that that was an important story too. And then also that meant exploring how how American universities made these decisions, which in the voluminous records on the intellectual migration, very little is about how the universities decided which scholars they were going to save. So I wanted to tell both the story of the scholars who weren't able to come to the United States, and then also the story of American universities and their response.
Terrific. And, you know, for some of us who've been around at Scholars Risk for a while, we went back to that history when we were starting, because our project was very much motivated by the Emergency Committee. But for those who are in our audience who may not be as familiar with that, could you just remind them what is the context of the committee? What was the scale at that time that they were dealing with?
Right. So just a little bit of history too. Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and almost immediately a law is enacted that bars Jews and non-Aryans, and those are two different and importantly different categories. But in the case of this legislation, it was Jews and anyone who had a Jewish grandparent from working for the state in any capacity. And since all German universities were state-run, that meant that scholars, about 2,000 of them, were dismissed immediately in the first year from German universities. So in the United States, 3 men in New York City, and I have to say none of them were particularly prominent scholars themselves, they were mostly Jewish philanthropists, decided to form a committee to try and encourage American universities to offer these scholars positions. And they did it under the auspices, I mean, and this was very quick. So the law was passed in April, the committee was formed in 1933, in May of that year, and then the decision was made to house it in the Institute for International Education, which was run by a man named Stephen Dugan. He had been a former professor at City University, and this was an exchange program between the United States, of students between the United States and foreign countries. But as a result of that work, he realized fairly quickly what was happening in Germany, agreed to have the emergency committee under its auspices, and assigned the assistant director, who this was his second job out of the University of Washington, to run the program in his off hours. And the man was Edward R. Murrow, the famous journalist, not a famous journalist, broadcaster at the time. And so that was what the committee did. The committee was designed to encourage American universities to make hiring offers to foreign scholars. And why the offers from American universities was so important was not only did it give people a chance to have a job and continue doing their research, but it also meant that they at least had a chance of qualifying for what was called a non-quota visa. Non-quota visas were for professors who'd been, practicing as professors in their home country for 2 years prior to immigration, and in coming to the United States, we're going to continue their vocation of professor, and that qualified them for a non-quota visa, which meant there was no limit on the number of visas that could be issued, unlike regular visas, of which there was a country-by-country limit as well as an annual limit. And the State Department, in interpreting this non-quota provision that was part of the law, decided that in order to prove that someone was going to continue their profession in the United States, they needed to have an offer from an American university saying they were going to employ them. So that's the committee then tried to make those offers happen.
And I think that's the process we're familiar with now, that matchmaking. So you've already mentioned sort of Einstein and Arendt, right? I mean, those stories we know, and there are others
right.
in our class that we know. But
right, the Frankfurt School, the people who did the work on the atomic weapon. There are a lot of famous stories about scholars who came to the United States.
What are one or two of the not so famous stories that you want people to remember as they remember the other side of the coin?
Well, I think that's a really important question. I follow in the book 8 scholars in particular, and I'll just introduce you to 2 of them. One was a woman named Leonore Brescher. Leonore was born in Romania. Her parents died when she was fairly young. She then went to the University of Vienna to study biology. Her specialty was the adaptation of white butterflies. And she was at the University of Vienna. She was teaching there. She tried to get habilitation there. She was denied that. I think most people agree for both anti-Semitic and sexist reasons. She was Jewish. So she then began a kind of peripatetic research career. She was in Berlin, she was in Hamburg, she was in Cambridge, and then she landed a job at the University of Kiel in 1932. In 1933, the lab she was working in, which was run by a man named Rudolf Hober, he was fired from his position because he was Jewish. The lab was closed down. She had no work. She tried to get a job in the United States. She knew one of the board members of the emergency committee they had worked together at the university in Berlin a couple years earlier, but she wasn't able to. She ended up going back to Vienna. One of her professors or dissertation advisor allowed her to, he was the founder of the Institute for Experimental Biology in Vienna. He allowed her to sleep in the institute and work for a while as his assistant. Eventually, she was able to return to her research. She was very excited about the way her research was going. And then in 1938, the Germans annexed Austria to the Reich, imposed all of the restrictions on Austrian scholars that they had been in place in Germany. The institute was shut down immediately within weeks of the German annexation. All of the Jewish faculty, which was half the staff, were fired, including the founder and director of the institute. Brescher also lost her position, and then she made this sort of frantic effort, the end result of which I will not divulge, but to try and leave Austria. She understood, and she was actually came under the Romanian quota. The Romanian quota was tiny. It was even much smaller than the German quota. So her really only hope of coming to the United States was a non-quota visa. And I think Brescher was not world class. She wasn't necessarily, a world changing scholar, but she was incredibly dedicated, maybe even too dedicated. She tended to ramble on about her white butterflies. This was sort of the entirety of her life. And so she's, I think, one person that we should remember. And then the other one would be a man named Mikhail Gorlin, and he had been born in St. Petersburg in Russia. He came to study in Berlin at the University of Berlin, as many of the Russian scholars did. His specialty was Slavic literature. He got a PhD in Slavic literature from the University of Berlin. Then, of course, the Nazis came to power. He decided to flee. He fled to France. France had a relatively open border, so many of the scholars went to France. The problem was that you couldn't work in France, they couldn't get a work permit, so many of the scholars who were in France lived in destitute conditions, as did Gorlin and his now wife, a woman he had met in Berlin who was a medievalist. But they sort of managed to patch things together. But by 1939, when war had already broken out, Gorlin decided that it was probably a good idea to leave France. He tried to come to the United States. The problem with him too was he was 32 at this point, 31. Because of the disruption in leaving Berlin, he didn't necessarily have a world-class reputation either, although he was well known to a lot of Slavic scholars in the United States. But basically, he couldn't get a position in an American university. The Rockefeller Foundation, which was funding a lot of these scholars when they did get jobs in the United States, was not willing to fund him. In 1941, he was one of the 5,000 foreign Jews, mostly men, who were rounded up in Paris. It was the first big roundup of Jews in Paris, and sent to a concentration camp, an intern camp not too 80 miles outside of Paris. It then became very clear that the situation for him was very dire. The sort of network of Slavic scholars in the United States sort of kicked in, tried to get him a position. Ultimately, he did get an offer from the New School, but he still needed to get a non-quota visa, and I think I'll leave the story there.
Okay, well, I urge everyone to pick up the book and see not just those two stories, but the 6 others that are highlighted. If I can, in the book, you talk about the obstacles at that time. And I just want to quote, which I think, as you said, to have a chance at immigration, at the magic non-quota visa. Quote, scholars needed to be world-class and well-connected, not too old or too young, too right or too left, most important, too Jewish. Having money helped, being a woman did not. Do you think, looking from the past to today, any of those obstacles still exist?
Well, certainly I think having an international reputation helps. I think one of the dominant, what American universities were looking at is not humanitarian concerns, not necessarily what the scholar's position was, although, some people did, and you can't draw too broad a brush. But I think the basic idea is, what can you do for me? So if it was somebody whose reputation would enhance the university, that would be a reason to hire them. If it was even more mundane reasons, we have an opening, we need someone in this particular area. This is an area where maybe the American Academy isn't as strong, but the European Academy is stronger, Gestalt therapy or art history, then you might get hired. But if it was just a question of, is this a scholar in a dire situation who needs assistance, that usually was very low down on the criteria for deciding to admit someone. And then in the same way you were looking for someone who was going to enhance your reputation, you were also very concerned about not hiring someone who would cause problems. And that's where the too Jewish qualification came in. Many universities then were very reluctant to hire Jews to their academy. Some of them had what they literally called a one Jew rule, which was you could hire one Jew in a particular department, and that was usually acceptable. But as soon as you hired more than one, then they tended to, these are the anti-Semitic stereotypes at play, but they tended to be clannish, work together, and before you know it, your university, your department will be overrun by Jews. So plus you also ran the risk, or at least you feared you might run the risk, of the community objecting to the fact that you were hiring refugees, and particularly Jewish refugees. So I think the idea that this was less about humanitarian interests and more about what was good for the university, I suspect that a lot of those considerations are still in play today, although the factors themselves are probably somewhat different.
And I appreciate you also flagging there, certainly in Europe, the pressures were state pressures, but the obstacles you were describing to getting offers were from often within the higher education sector itself. It wasn't the state saying, don't hire these. It was more local.
Right. It started with, at least initial, it started with you needed to get an offer from a university. And that was usually done in the way that they did any kind of offer, meaning it started with a department, was there an opening? If there was an opening, then the faculty would look at the person's CV and they would make a decision about if this was someone who they thought might be interesting. They might make them an offer, then it would have to go up through the university hierarchy. So it really was a hiring decision like any other hiring decision. And I think one of the, in some ways, very chilling aspects of this is that the way they talked about people and the kind of decision making they engaged in is very similar to what we do in the academy currently. So it's like, oh, well, they published a great work, but nothing too interesting in the last 5 years, or they don't have enough publications, or we're worried they may not get along too well with undergraduates. I mean, it's the same kind of conversation, and yet certainly by the time you get to 1939, 1940, 1941, it is very clear to most of the people making this hiring decision is that if you do not make this job offer, not only is a person not going to be able to do their research, but they are very likely to be deported to Poland and die.
Let me just remind our participants that you can use the Q&A function if you want to send in some questions. And so Laurel, on that last point where you said, okay, let's bring it up to today. Obviously, we at Scholars at Risk are engaged in an exercise that was very much inspired by the World War II effort. In fact, when I started at Scholars at Risk, the first thing I did was I went to the library and I spent a week reading the history not only of the US Emergency Committee and the University in Exile at the New School, but also the counterparts at the predecessors to CARA in the UK and in France. And there really is, for those interested, a wonderfully rich history that also goes to Mexico and the Colegio de Mexico and Argentina and Istanbul and to the historically Black colleges here in the US and so forth. We're marking our 20th anniversary this year of service. And I think we, as Scholars at Risk, as our network and our partners, we have just about twice as many of scholars as the Emergency Committee did at its time. And if you add in the efforts of the PSI program in Germany and PAWS and CARA and SRF and IIE and UAF in the Netherlands and so forth, clearly the total numbers of individuals currently is higher than an annual level during that prior crisis. Do you have any insights from the history that would help us to know how do we gauge our progress? Are we doing okay?
Well, that's it. I mean, that's
at the time they must not have seen the obstacles that we just described in the same way. Do we have any blinders on, or have we learned in any good way?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question. I think that it is somewhat, I mean, some of the differences, which I think are probably where we should start, is first of all, most of the scholars, when you start in Germany and then it spreads to most of Europe, but there wasn't ambiguity in terms of who is endangered, who is not endangered. I mean, it was pretty clear. I mean, people just immediately lost their positions. A few people in Germany were able to hang on because perhaps they had fought in the Great War. But then it became, that didn't matter. And then if you were married to a Jew, you also would be fired. So and then that's became true in Austria and Czechoslovakia and France and Belgium and all of the countries of Europe. So the population you were dealing with were all, in some ways, even though there might be slight country by country differences, it was really sort of the same problem. It was Nazi Germany and how Nazi Germany treated, and not just Jewish academics, but anyone who was not accepting of the Nazi ideology. And so I think here you're dealing with it in some ways much more difficult because there are so many different countries with different kinds of agendas and different kinds of problems. While there it really was one problem manifesting itself in different countries. You know, of course, the difference is that certainly again, as you get to the wartime period, what you're dealing with is scholars who are going to be killed if they do not leave Europe. So that's another maybe difference. I know some of the scholars you deal with are also in that position, but it really became pretty much everyone. I think in terms of what we can learn, and this I think even has a little bit to do with what we're facing now in terms of the coronavirus and how we all have to change how we're teaching, is that one of the things that I think was impressive about the Emergency Committee and the New School, the University in Exile, and the Rockefeller Foundation is that as soon as it became obvious that the situation was much more serious even than it had been before. So primarily with the fall of France. I mean, when the Germans invaded France in 1940, which endangered French scholars, it also endangered a number of the people who had left Germany or Austria or Czechoslovakia and sought refuge in France. It became clear, I think particularly to the Rockefeller Foundation, that what this meant was that might be the end of Western civilization, or at least the United States was the last bulwark of the Western Enlightenment, and that they anticipated that even Great Britain was going to fall. So they very quickly, and there might be some objections to this philosophically, but they very quickly put together of who are the 100 scholars in these countries that is most important to save, and to save for humanity and Western civilization, not because they were necessarily themselves more personally endangered. And then they were also very able to pivot very quickly. So I had described before this kind of slow process of waiting for a university to make an offer and then going up through the administration and then sending out an offer. At the fall of France, they switched completely. One of the beauties of the New School and the way the New School operated is Alvin Johnson, who was the president of the New School and had founded the University in Exile. All he had to do is say, I want to hire a scholar. And then the scholar was hired. So you didn't have to go through all of this apparatus. And the Rockefeller Foundation then decided that was the way they were going to operate. They were going to have Johnson consult with them about who they wanted to hire, and then the Rockefeller Foundation would fund the position, and they really were able to change very quickly to deal with the changing circumstances and not hold to these practices which made sense in one context but didn't make sense in another context. I should say, though, that even though that was very good, and it was all that those agencies can do. They weren't able to get in as many scholars as they wanted. They weren't even able to get in 100. They brought in about 60 at this point, because then the problem became the State Department and the State Department's willingness to issue non-quota visas. So it's not, they did what they could, but it actually ended up not being enough because of the State Department.
And so I appreciate that. And I appreciate to clarify in response to a question, the comparison to the Emergency Committee obviously was very different at different times, as you point out. And one of the ways we talk about our work today is that there are two dimensions. There's the chronic dimension, which really happens all over the world. Any one individual scholar could be targeted, whereas at any moment there may be an acute crisis. Clearly in the World War II era, there was an acute crisis, starting with the attacks on Jewish scholars and then spreading from there. In our time recently, in the prior panel, we talked about the crisis in Turkey, which was really, in some ways, very similar, where all of a sudden thousands of scholars were targeted across many, many disciplines, but in one localized place. Or we see it in the conflict in Syria. We saw the same earlier years, the conflict in Iraq. But we only have
I just want to say one quick thing
Go ahead.
About Turkey. Because I think this is sort of one of the ironies, maybe, is that one of the places that a large number of scholars went was the University of Istanbul. That Ataturk, was very excited about the possibility of hiring German and Austrian and scholars. So at least for a period, it then changed in about 1938. But a number of scholars went to Turkey, to the University of Istanbul, and it seems as if in important ways transformed Turkish education. So the idea of Turkey as now being the fulcrum of oppression is very sad.
Yeah, although I did appreciate in the prior panel the fact that, as I go back to my point of are we doing anything better now, the way many of the scholars in Turkey have linked up and used technologies, try to preserve that free space for thought and so forth. We only have about 1 minute left, so if I could close us with the last thought, which is, today we're doing this Congress virtually because of the new threat, of course, of the coronavirus. In the World War II era, as noted in your book, basically the relief efforts had to effectively shut down in 1941 when the war overtook those efforts. If you have any insights from your research, where you might point us to how do we make sure 2020 isn't another 1941, and how do we adapt our work to the current times?
Right. I think one of the ways is that you don't, I mean, it did shut down in 1941, and it was partially because of the war, but it was still possible to get people out. So it wasn't necessarily an impossible situation or a situation where there were impenetrable barriers. It really became an easy excuse, both for universities who then started echoing what the State Department was saying about the possibility of, maybe these people are going to be spies. Their allegiance is actually to Nazi Germany. And so it really, at that point, it shifted to the State Department, I think, frankly, who had always wanted to limit immigration and made it very hard even for scholars to immigrate. It made it easier for them to raise that excuse and have people just blindly accept it. So I think what I would say in this era is to make sure, there are good reasons, obviously, with a global pandemic, not to have completely open borders. But there also are people who are using this as an excuse for shutting down international cooperation, for making it harder for people to move between countries. And I think it's important that everyone, but particularly scholars, because now, we understand the importance of international networks. We depend on international networks. And I think it means that it is even more important for us to make sure that when states take these actions, that they're doing it out of genuine concerns and not taking advantage of a situation. So that, to me, would be the most important lesson.
Terrific. Well, I appreciate, we'll have to leave it there. We're a little bit over time, but thank you for doing the history work, for reminding us that even at the times that we're celebrating 20 years, we want to look and make sure, are we really doing enough? Thank you for leaving us on that point of the importance of our networks and connected to each other. I don't mind putting it in the questions.
I'm glad I had a chance to be here in some form or other.
I want to mention I'll put up the screen again in 1 second, the book, but also from a friend and colleague at the New School, Judith Friedlander, another book, A Light in Dark Times, the New School Social Research and its University in Exile, which also describes some of this history. And let me put up Laurel's book one more time, well worth saving, America's Universities, Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe. So thank you everyone for taking part. Laurel, thank you so much for sharing. And we will pause for just a brief moment and start with our 12 o'clock panel very soon. Thank you all.